This is Daniel Simon at Baton Rouge Community College, and this week I'll be continuing talking about the Roman Empire. As of now, I'm kind of getting up to discussing how the Roman Empire begins to decline in the West. Before I had discussed how they had the crisis of the third century, where the Roman Empire began to decline and almost break up. Well, at the time, if you get to the late third century, you have Emperor Diocletian that comes in, and Diocletian does begin to make some reforms to the Roman Empire, which divide it into an Eastern and a Western Roman Empire. His Tetrarchy, which we'll talk about later, is a Roman government that really saves the empire for a while. But then, of course, you have civil wars that break out when Emperor Constantine the Great comes in. So we'll talk about Constantine the Great. He becomes, of course, the first Roman emperor to convert to Christianity. And you'll start seeing how the Roman Empire eventually becomes more of a Christian state. So I'll discuss that and kind of get into and discuss the first Council of Nicaea that really ends up creating what would be the Christian church itself. Also, I'll get into later how the Roman Empire eventually divides permanently. I'll get into Theodosius the Great. He's one of the last Roman emperors that really rules over both halves, both the Western and Eastern Roman Empire. And then after that, the Roman Empire breaks up. So you go into like the 5th century AD, and you end up with the Western Empire eventually does decline. I'll discuss how the western part of the Roman Empire eventually gets invaded by various Germanic peoples. You also have the Huns come in. The Huns, of course, attacked Europe. Like you got King Attila the Hun, of course. We'll talk about him, of course, the most. And that eventually leads to, of course, the Roman Empire in the West collapsing. So you end up with this Eastern Roman Empire that kind of survives afterwards, which later becomes, of course, known as the Byzantine Empire. So I'll kind of talk about how the Roman Empire declines and then breaks up. And of course, that leads into the Middle Ages later. Also, at the end of this lecture, I will have a review for this final exam. The final exam for the semester is going to be, of course, on the Roman Empire. So it should have those, several parts that I've got, really parts 1, 2, and 3 that have merged together. So that's going to be the main assessment I'll have, of course, for the final exam. The Middle Ages, which we'll have lectures on later, will be assessed on something else. So that's kind of a preview of what's coming up with this lecture on the later part of the Roman Empire. Today's lecture will kind of get into the decline and collapse of the Roman Empire. We, of course, have the Western Empire that collapses by the late 5th century. And then you do have the continuation of the Eastern Roman Empire, which historians later call the Byzantine Empire. So I'll kind of briefly talk about that today. Into, I think, where we were last time, if I remember correctly, I talked about the Severan dynasty. I think that was that major dynasty that took over after Commodus was assassinated, if you remember correctly, in 192. And then we talked about that dynasty. And then I started getting into a new period that comes in that's called the crisis of the 3rd century, which occurs like over about a 50-year period in the middle of the 3rd century. And this happened right after Severus Alexander. He was the last Severan emperor. He was killed. He was assassinated by the Praetorian Guard, I believe, his own people. And that brought on this crisis period, which went on for about 50 years. And the Roman Empire actually almost collapsed, literally imploded. I'll get to it later. It really almost breaks up at one point as well. They do have different nicknames for it, by the way. They sometimes call it the military anarchy, I think is one name. Some people call it the imperial crisis period as well. But you can see those are the years down there, 235 to 284 is the time period of it. And during that time, not just civil war that broke out, but They had barbarian invasions into the country as well. So you get different barbarians. You saw that short video at the beginning, all the different peoples that start trying to attack the Roman Empire. So you get that happening. Plagues also have more of those kind of outbreaks as well. A lot of economic uncertainty, depressions kind of occur. One big thing that happened too was that the currency became debased. It wasn't really worth much. They took a lot of the minerals out of it. You also have a lot of emperors that get assassinated is another thing that happens as well. In fact, during that 50-year period, there was something like around 20 emperors, maybe 26 that tried to claim the throne. And a lot of the emperors were called sometimes barracks emperors, or another name they were called were soldier emperors, because of the fact that they came out of the Roman armies and all that. Another thing that happened here, which is really crazy during the whole crisis period, you have this so-called year of the six emperors, where in 238 CE or AD, you had a deal where there were six emperors that really reigned. Maximinus Trax, I think, had been emperor for a few years. Then you had several emperors that tried to take power. Gordian the First and his son Gordian the Second. There was also another one named Papianus, Balbinus. And there was also a Gordian the Third, who I think was related back to Gordian the First and Second. And so you have this deal where basically, I think the military tries to kind of take over the empire. That's how bad things work, where you have six emperors in in 1 year. That's almost like 2 months an emperor if you think about that. And so that's the kind of anarchy that was kind of going on during that period. Then they also had another deal you see here where the empire broke up into 3 different states. Kind of look at this right here, but you had the Gallic Empire that, of course, formed in the west. There was also one which was the Palmyrene Empire, which was in the east. The Gallic Empire was supposed to be like Gaul and part of Germany and Britain. And then you can see the Palmyrene Empire was in the east, included like parts of like Turkey, Syria, Israel, and Egypt that were in it. And then you see they had a Italian-centered independent Roman Empire, of course, that was in the middle. This went on, by the way, for about almost 10 years that the empire went through this kind of period. So it could have broken up, at that point, and that would have been the end of the Roman Empire. But they had this emperor that came in named Aurelian, who only reigned around 5 years. You can see 270 to 275. And he's important because they think he's one of the main emperors that helps to reunite the empire and put it back together. It's almost like Humpty Dumpty, got to put it back together. And he helps end the crisis period. And then I'll get to Emperor Diocletian later. He comes in and starts doing reforms that kind of help end it as well. But he was this militaristic type emperor that really forced those 2 empires back into the Roman Empire. He also had to deal with fighting barbarians, like various tribes that were trying to attack the empire as well. So he had to fight like the Goths and other different peoples that were attacking the empire as well. And Aurelian got this nickname you can see. He was called the Restorer of the World, is what the Roman Senate called him. And so he was able to put the empire back together because of that, his military, successes. Yeah, there are always different, tribes that are trying to attack. So you have Franks, Alemanni, Vandals, different Gothic tribes also as well. So you had to fight off all these different tribes that were trying to, invade into the Roman Empire, which they'd been doing before overall. So after that, he's able to bring all those sections of the empire that are out back in. The other thing he did too, which is really famous, he actually, after that, in that same period, he also constructed what they call the Aurelian walls. These were new fortifications that were built to protect Rome from being attacked by different barbarians. And like I said, it superseded the ancient Servian walls, which had been built a long time ago under the Roman monarchy. I think I've got a map showing you different pictures of it you can look at, but it's named after Emperor Aurelian. I think the average walls were originally built to about 26 feet tall, but later walls were expanded to close to like 50 feet in height. And here's some aerial views, of course, of the wall in modern Rome today. But you can see it even had some, gates that were built into it as well with watchtowers. And you can see the area kind of surrounds a lot of the main area of Rome, where the original 7 walls is, and the original Servian wall that's there. And so that helped to kind of, I guess, prevent Rome from falling, which Rome won't really be officially attacked again until like the 5th century, when that'll happen. So I'm going to move on next. I did want to talk about this other emperor, of course, they had that came to power, which was Emperor Diocletian. He's kind of an important ruler that comes in. Diocletian reigned from about 284 to 305. He's important because he helps come in and also helps to end that crisis period that we were talking about. I think he rose up from like lower class background, believe it or not. I want to say his father was the son of a slave or something like that, that kind of deal. He rose up through the military and the Praetorian Guard, and eventually became the ruler in the East. Actually, I think is what happens later. He's going to be like the Eastern Augustus. I'll get to that in a second. But he's basically the emperor at that point of the whole empire. So he helps to stabilize it. He mostly does this through various reforms that he does to the Roman Empire. And one of the first things he does is he creates a new title for the emperor that he begins adopting, which a lot of emperors used later. And that's the title, which is Dominus, the Dominus title, which is a title that meant either lord or master. And it was like an autocratic title saying that, the ruler was not really a princeps now, princeps, as they say it, which was the old title, which meant first citizen. Almost like he was like the head of like a republic or something like that. So he got rid of that pretension of that. And the ruler is more of an autocratic type rule overall. So that actually begins a new period in the Roman Empire, which is called the Dominate period, because of that title being used by the Roman emperors. And from 284 up to 476, the Western Empire uses it. And then I think the Eastern Empire still uses it too for a while after that as well. Here's kind of a slide more, of course, about some of the things he did with reform. So you got the title Dominus he adopted as well. The big thing he's known for, Diocletian, is the Roman Tetrarchy. The Tetrarchy was this Roman system of governance where they had 4 rulers that ran the empire instead of just having one emperor. There were 2 rulers. One, they had an Augustus, one in the west and one in the east. And then they had 2 Caesars, one in the west and one in the east. The Augustus or Augusti, which is the plural version, was like the main emperors they had. So you had 2 emperors that are one. And then you had these 2 successor emperors that were under them as well. Diocletian became one of the rulers in the East, is what would happen, in Eastern Augustus. Now, I think I've got a thing showing it right here with the Western Augustus and the Eastern Augustus. And Diocletian was set up in the East, you can see, and then he put in power Western Augustus named Maximian. And those 2 actually ruled together for almost 20 years, to like close to 305. And then in the West and East, they had these Caesars. They had Constantius was the Western Caesar, and then they had Galerius was the Eastern Caesar that was in the East. So you can see that too in that little slide right there. One of the things that happens, if you know about this, it later helps to divide the Roman Empire in half. You got the Western Roman Empire and the Eastern Roman Empire, which is later called also Byzantine as well. Over time, they have capitals. Well, the Western Empire has Rome originally. It's later moved to the city of Ravenna. And then the one in the east, Byzantine, is the capital, Constantinople, now Istanbul. By the way, the word tetrarchy is a Greek word from the word tetrarchia, which means, put it on the screen if you want, tetrarchia. It means rule by four, or some people also say leadership by four. So the rulers are called tetrarchs, I think is the common term that they'll use. It's almost like having four kings or almost four emperors in a sense, two senior emperors and two junior emperors that you have. And the Tetrarchy was important. It did kind of create stability for around 15, 20 years, and it allowed line of succession. So the Augustus of the East and the West would sometimes pick a successor, and then they would take over afterwards in West and East. And I guess whoever took over would then choose their successor below them. So it made rule more effective, and so basically each ruler would reign over a certain section, like 1/4 of the empire. I think here's kind of a map showing you too, kind of how they broke it up among the four rulers right here. But you can see the area where Diocletian had it was mostly like Turkey, Syria, and Egypt right there. You can see Maximian had Italy, Spain, Africa. Constantius ruled over like Gaul and Britain. And then you can see also Galerius, looks like he reigned over Dalmatia, like where Yugoslavia used to be, in mostly Greece. So those are the areas that they kind of controlled overall. You'll also notice they've got a thing there where they divided it up into what they call dioceses, which over time dioceses will later be like these church districts where bishops, rule over like the different parts of the empire, and later the Catholic Church domains and stuff like that. And that kind of came out of that originally, out of the Tetrarchy. If you go back to that other slide right there, there's a few other things that Diocletian was also known for as well. He also had this thing called the Edict of Maximum Prices that he had. There was a real bad period of inflation under this time, which they think a lot of had to do with the currency, was just kind of debased, if you know about that. And so he tried to set like price fixes on everything, even like wage fixes and stuff like that. I think I've got a slide showing that too, the different ones. I think I've got, let me show you this other map I've got too. I didn't show you also as well. Here's kind of another map showing the first Tetrarchy as well. You want to look at that later. But yeah, here's examples. So they would set these maximum wages and prices that were fixed, like even people's wages were fixed and things like that. And it was actually unpopular. People didn't like it. And I think there was a case where they basically ignored it. And so it never really worked out. And I think it wasn't really till Constantine the Great came in that they were able to fix everything with creating better currency and things like that. But yeah, inflation was a big, big problem, going back to the 3rd century and under Diocletian's reign. Now, there is one thing he is famous for, Diocletian, which he's notorious for, which he got connected with him. But it was actually a case where for about 10 years, the Romans instigated the last persecution of Christians throughout the empire. It was called the Diocletianic persecution. And then the Catholic Church later called it the Great Persecution. Just kind of exaggerated, they think. But they're not sure. They think it's not really his idea. They think it was actually Galerius, I think was one of the rulers, that kind of the tetrarch that kind of supported the idea more than anything. And so starting in 303, what happened in the empire, they banned Christians from being like in the government or being in the Roman military. And if you didn't give, tribute to like the traditional pagan gods and things like that, you could be persecuted. And so the whole Diocletianic persecution was really an attempt to save the traditional Roman religions. They were kind of declining at the time. And you have to understand that, kind of give you an idea of Christianity, between 250 up to about 300, the actual population of Christians in the Roman Empire, it increased drastically. It went from like around 1 million people to about 6 million. And so that had a lot to do with it. They think that may have been 10% or more of the actual population. And so people weren't going to the temples. They were going to like a church instead, I guess. And so they attempted it, but in the end, it actually failed. In fact, I think it made more people sympathetic towards Christianity. And so later, of course, we'll get to it. Various edicts are passed later, which bans that. And Christianity eventually, over time, will become one of the main religions of the Roman Empire. Diocletian was known for his building projects. Like he built like the so-called baths of Diocletian. I think that was kind of considered some of the last, baths that were built in Rome that were well known. And he also was known for his palace. He had this famous palace that he built, which is now in Croatia, Diocletian's palace, or the palace of Diocletian. And if you know what happened, in 305 CE, Diocletian retired. He had health issues. He wasn't able to do his job. And so he decided to retire. And if you know what happened, he made the emperor in the West retire too, as well. The Western Augustus had to retire also. And so he stepped down. So I think they say that Diocletian was one of the first emperors in like Roman history to actually retire, which he did on his own. I think he would die about 6 years later, around 311 or 312 is when he died. Now, the only thing is, when we get to this in a second, it's going to create a civil war that breaks out. There's going to be this case where they have what they call the civil wars, the Tetrarchy, that break out, especially in the West. There's kind of infighting over who should be the ruler, and it occurs over like 18 years. 306 to 324 is the last stage of the Tetrarchy. After that, they get rid of it, the Romans. And there was a Roman general that was in the West. His name was Constantine. They later called him Constantine the First, or Constantine the Great, also Saint Constantine, I think in the Catholic Orthodox churches as well. And he was actually the son of Constantius, who was one of the rulers that took over in the West. But what happened was, apparently after he became the ruler, I think he was one of the rulers in the West. He died, he dropped dead. And so his son tried to take the throne and all that. And that's what kind of creates the mess. I'll get to Constantine in a second right there. But here's kind of a map of what things would look like, of course, in the West. This was after Diocletian was stepped down. So you had Constantius and Maxentius were the rulers that were in the West. And in the East, you had two rulers, which were Licinius and Maximianus. Those are kind of the rulers they had by about 311. However, what happened was, in the West, there was a bunch of infighting that occurred between the rulers. You had Constantine, of course, the Great, later, that, of course, wanted the throne because his father had died, Constantius. And there were two other men that wanted the throne, too. They had Maxentius and they had Maximianus. Maximianus was the original Augustus in the West. That was, I think, with Diocletian. And then he had a son named Maximianus, they had as well, or Maximian, I think for short. He wanted the throne, too, as well. So you had these three different men that wanted to fight over it. And what happened eventually was that, I think what happened was Maximianus, he was eventually forced to kill himself. He committed suicide, I want to say in 310 in the war. And then the most pivotal thing that happened, of course, Battle of Milvian Bridge, which happened in 312. Constantine marched on Rome and defeated Maxentius's forces close to Rome, or right outside of Rome. A bridge called Milvian Bridge happened October 28, 312, and Maxentius died in the battle. I think he fell in the river, drowned. Supposedly there's a story where Constantine, at that battle, decided to convert to Christianity. Suppose he was this deal where he saw some kind of sign of a cross in the air, and basically decided that he was going to, become Christian after that. And so he would later adopt to Christianity and become the first Christian emperor of the Roman Empire. There's kind of a debate about whether that happened or not. Some people think that might be a story that Christian writers made up about Constantine. They do know that he becomes sympathetic towards Christians. He's baptized on his deathbed, Constantine. Constantine, they think, converts over to Christianity at that point. They do have a deal where Constantine and now the ruler in the east is a ruler named Galerius. Those two basically come together and they issue edicts that end the persecution of Christians at that point. There's actually two edicts that do this, not really one. The first edict was issued by Galerius, who was the Eastern Augustus, which was called the Edict of Toleration, or also called the Edict of Serdica, issued in 311 in the Eastern Roman Empire. And you can see what it did was it ended a lot of the persecutions that were in the Eastern Roman Empire. It also made Christianity a legal religion as well. So Romans could practice that religion. It was accepted by the Roman Empire as well, along with other religions that they had. And then Constantine had his own edict in the West called the Edict of Milan. He issued in 313 in Italy. And that one did the same thing, except in the West, is what it did. So it gave legal status, of course, to Christianity there. Over time, what's going to happen, is that Christianity is going to become the main religion of the Roman Empire. But at that point, the middle of the 4th century, you can practice Christianity and other religions, like pagan religions as well. Now, one thing that's going to happen, so there you go, there's Constantine the Great. He's going to eventually combine the empire together. One thing that's going to occur, Galerius actually dies of a horrible illness. They think it was maybe either gangrene or cancer he had, apparently. And this other ruler in the east, Eastern Augustus, Licinius, would take over. And those two came to loggerheads. Constantine and Licinius didn't get along, and it led to a civil war again, the end of the Tetrarchy Civil War. And eventually Constantine defeated him in 324 and seized control of the Roman Empire. And so after that, you can see with this map, Augustus will actually go on to rule over the whole empire by himself as sole ruler for about 13 years, 324 to 337. You can see here, by the way, how he progresses with that. So at one point, he only controlled the western part, like Britain, France, and Spain, when he was like just a Western Caesar. Then he became the Western Augustus, and then after that, he became the sole ruler of the Roman Empire as well. And so with that, one thing that came out of it, if you know about it, was that Constantine then started making reforms to the Christian church, which was kind of starting to kind of organize at that point better. And he convened what became known as the First Council of Nicaea, which they met in the northern part of Turkey in 325 CE. And the First Council of Nicaea, there was actually a second one later, was like a church council, or some people call it an ecumenical council, between the various cleric officials of this church. They went there to lay the foundations of the church, also to deal with like theological issues with the church. What books were they going to, be part of the church as well? Like the later future books that are in like the New Testament and all that. We'll kind of start deciding that there and afterwards. And they had different issues though at this council in 325 when they met. One of the big issues that really caused problems in the 4th century in the Roman Empire was this issue over the nature of God, especially Jesus. Like, what is Jesus and all that, divinity-wise. And they had this thing called Arianism, or the Arian controversy, that was kind of taking over the empire, which had started in Egypt. And I've got a picture of Arius right here. Arius was this, they think, a Christian presbyter that they think tried to make this idea that God was not like one thing. It was actually two things, like a father and son. And what Arius believed was that the Father had beget the Son, like the Father had created the Son, like Jesus. And he thought that the Father was actually greater than Jesus, which was kind of a controversy. So you have these almost like two co-eternal gods that you have instead of, like, say, one God. And so this was like a big controversy within the church at the time. And so they think what happened because of that, it led to the creation of these two things you see on the right. The Trinity was developed, the Trinitarianism, and then the Nicene Creed was also adopted as well. The Trinity, of course, was this idea that the doctrine of like what God was that God is one God, but exists in the form of three persons: the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Basic there. And then the one on the right, you see the Nicene Creed is a Christian statement of like faith or belief on, in Christianity, Jesus, the Trinity, and it was put into the Christian Mass is what eventually happened. And the reason why they did this, by the way, this profession of faith they put in, like they say, the Mass, was to stamp out the heresy of Arianism. That was the reason why they did it in the 4th century. So Trinity and all that did not exist before the 4th century. Go back to the time of Jesus and all that, when Christianity first developed. None of this exists until the 4th century. Another thing, too, they decided on, if you know about it, from here on out, in the 4th century, they decided what books were going to be in the New Testament. I know they kind of started to select which gospel accounts would be considered canonized right there. So, yeah, obviously Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, those are the ones that kind of are included. Acts, Paul's letters are included, general letters, and the Apocalypse, the book of Revelation, are eventually, added as well. And they think that the books of the New Testament they think they were compiled eventually by about 400, at least later. They start trying to compile it right now, but by the time of like St. Jerome, who helps to write the Bible together, he's the one that's really going to form it together as a whole, like a Latin translation, all that. And they originally include in the beginning 27 books of the New Testament, and then they also add the Old Testament as well, which has 39 books in it as well. They also think at that time the First Council of Nicaea also set when Easter would be. They'd say it was in the spring time, coincide close to when Passover is, although they didn't want to have the same time as when the Jews had it. But it's basically around the same time, and sometimes even falls at the same time occasionally. But it's all because of the moon, basically it's why it's off. And then Sunday Sabbath, I think, is something that they start kind of also push, because in the Roman Empire, under Constantine and afterwards, this Sunday Sabbath kind of becomes like a day of rest. It's something you start seeing up through medieval times and so on. That's something that kind of follows also as later. So, yeah, there's other ecumenical councils of the church will have later, but this is really the one that really set the tone for what would be the Christian church over time. Then, of course, by the Middle Ages, the church is going to split. You're going to go from like this Orthodox church in the East, the Catholic Church in the West. That'll happen over time. Now, one other thing that Constantine did, you may have heard about, that's really famous. He, besides the Council of Nicaea, of course, the big thing he's well known for, Constantinople. If you know about that, he founded it, they think, in 330, new capital of the Roman Empire, which Constantine wanted a city that was a Christian city because Rome was still kind of considered like associated with paganism and all that. And so he founds this new city in the east, in now what is part of Western Turkey, right below the Black Sea on the Sea of Marmara. And this capital eventually over time will become the capital of what we now call the Eastern Roman Empire or Byzantine Empire as well. And originally the capital was going to be called New Rome, or I think the other name is Nova Roma. That's what they were going to call it. That's what he wanted to call it initially. You see Constantinople, which is right there. That was the name that he wanted to call it, but the people wanted to name it after him, and so it got named Constantinople, the city of Constantine. And so that's the name that stood for many years, up through the Middle Ages, until the Turks came in and, took Constantinople in 1453. They renamed it now Istanbul, which is the modern name, which you're looking at right there in that picture. They do think that the actual city, this Christian city that he founded back then, was founded on an old ancient Greek city called Byzantium, I think he called it. And so he built it on top of that city. And so that's sometimes where the name Byzantine, or some people say Byzantine, is the name they usually nickname the Eastern Roman Empire. That would, evolve over time. So I guess he's kind of considered like the founder of what would be later the Byzantine Empire and its future capital that you're looking at right there. Yeah, there's a kind of a map showing you, but that's basically where it's based. You can see right below the Black Sea. It's kind of between almost like Turkey and Greece now today, but it's like located where the Sea of Marmara is, and it was built on a heavily fortified peninsula to prevent people from attacking it. And also it was right where the trade routes are, going from east to west, with Asia, trade with Asia and all that. But the Byzantine Empire would kind of grow in size to about the 6th century under Emperor Justinian the Great. And then after that, it shrank over time in the Middle Ages. Yeah, also, Constantine also had a dynasty, Constantinian dynasty, if you can see. So actually had 3 sons that reigned afterwards. Constantine the First, of course, reigned first. And then he had his son, Constantine the Second, Constans, and Constantius the Second. So he had 3 different sons that would rule. I think Julian was, I want to say, a nephew of his that reigned briefly, 361 to 363. He's very famous. He's sometimes called Julian the Apostate because he was this last emperor that was a pagan, like the only one they have left. And after that, all the emperors are Christian in the West and East and all that. Now, let me move on. I want to talk for a few minutes about Theodosius the Great. He's another great emperor that comes in later. One thing that happens in the Roman Empire, it eventually splits permanently. If you know about this, most Romans don't view it as that. They see it kind of as like 2 courts, one in the West, one in the East. But pretty much they think around close to 400, the empire is going to split permanently into 2 separate empires. And a lot to do with this emperor that you're looking at right here, Theodosius the Great. He's also called Theodosius the First as well. In fact, he actually creates two of the last major dynasties, they think. The one in the east, I think, was the Theodosian dynasty. There was one in the west called the Valentinian dynasty as well. And what happened was he seized control of the empire for a few years. Like he was actually reigning back in 379 as the Eastern Roman Emperor. And then for a few years, like I want to say 2 or 3 years, he briefly took control of the Western Empire and became its like last sole ruler that ruled over both of them. And he had to also fight off like the Goths again. Like that's another problem. They keep having problems with the Goths because I think it was a case where one of the even Roman emperors had been killed, Emperor Valens, fighting against the Goths. I think it was the Visigoths. So yeah, what he does, he decides to divide the whole thing up as one thing he's going to do later on. You're going to see this case where West and East, it's divided up. Before I get to that, though, there's something he does before that that's very famous. He issues this edict that's called the Edict of Thessalonica. And what that does is it makes Nicene Christianity, not other Christian forms like they have Arian Christianity that was also around, but Nicene Christianity, based on the First Council of Nicaea, that becomes the state church of the Roman Empire. Thessalonica is a city in like where Macedonia was in northern Greece now, but he issued it from there. And so one of the things that happened afterwards, if you know about Theodosius, he began trying to actually stamp out paganism. So if you were pagan, like a pagan religion, you were persecuted. It's kind of like reversed, I guess, of what happened after that. And then you can see he even went further. And I think we've talked about it before when we were talking about the Greeks. He banned the Olympics in 393 too, as well. So yeah, that's something that's kind of famous about that course. And then, of course, the other thing he did, like I said, was he split the Roman Empire in half. He died in 395, controlling both halves. And he took his two main sons, Honorius and Arcadius, and he put Honorius as the ruler in the West. He became the Western Roman Emperor, and then Arcadius became the emperor in the East. So you get these two separations of the empire after that. And so the empire just does not get back together again. There's no more rulers that reign over both halves, from then on out. So that's one of the things that happened. And the one on the left, Honorius, he was actually famous for moving the capital of Rome. Rome was the capital, for years up to that time in the early 5th century. But in 408 CE, he moved the capital to Ravenna, to the north, close to what is on the Adriatic Sea. It's not that far from Venice. And he did that for defensive purposes because they thought Rome would get attacked, which it did. And the Goths came down. I think it was one of the groups that attacked it. I know Goths and the Vandals both attack it and sack it. And so it was more defensible right there in that location. And so that becomes the later capital of the Roman Empire in the West that they have. Most people don't know about that, but that's something that's true, of course, at the end of the Roman Empire in the West. Now, they do have one last major ruler that does reign in the West, Valentinian III. They consider him to be one of the last major rulers that really is a pretty good ruler that's in power for about, you can see, 30 years. And he's one of the longest reigning Western emperors that you have. He actually was able to fight off a lot of barbarian invasions. That's one of the things that he had to deal with as emperor in the West. Valentinian III, especially trying to fight off the Huns. And part of it was because of the fact that he had a lot of great generals that were under him. I think the two big generals that were under that period were, I don't think it was one called Felix, I know, but the one that was the most famous was Flavius Aetius, who helped fight off the Huns and all that. And during this time period, you have a period that comes in called the migration period, where the Roman Empire is repeatedly invaded by barbarians, is what they called them back then. I think even up to modern times, they call them the barbarian invasion. They're kind of a mix of mostly Germanic peoples and other Eurasian peoples that come out of the East and attack the Roman Empire, the West and the East as well. And there's like a different ones that they call, kind of get involved in that invade the Roman Empire. But this goes on for many centuries. Like fourth century, I think, is when it starts. Then you can even go up to like the time of the Vikings. You got different peoples that invade Europe at one point. They have a German name for it, by the way. It's often called the Volkerwanderung, which means in German, the wandering of the people. So you have all these Germanic peoples mostly that start leaving Germany or Germania, start going into the empire. The reason why they did this was because they wanted to go live in the Roman Empire where things are better, I guess, economically. Kind of like people in Latin America want to come to America, right? It's kind of like that. Practically, invading across the Rio Grande. So that's, one thing like that. And then also, a lot of them were also fleeing, like the Huns and others. They were invading Europe as well. They were terrorized by the Huns, and so some of them fled them as well. What's going to happen? This is going to lead to the fall of the Western Empire. It's one of the big things that occurs where the Western Empire gets conquered by all these different barbarians that invade that state in the West. Here's kind of an image of it right here. But yeah, those are some of the different groups that come in that are famous. So the Germans, you got like the Goths. There's different Goths I'll get into in a second. Franks, the Vandals, the Burgundians also come in. Different Anglo-Saxons, such as the Angles, the Saxons, the Jutes, which are kind of similar. I don't have in there also as well, but I think the Alemanni, I think was another one. The Lombards, I think was another group that came in. Eurasians that were either like Eastern Europe or Asian, Avars, Magyars, Bulgars, of course the Huns also as well. The Alans, I think, was another group that also came in as well. So all these different peoples that kind of come in to the empire at one point. But the Huns we'll get to in a second later. They were the most fierce, of course, that attacked the Western Empire, also the Eastern Empire as well. Here's kind of a map, of the Roman Empire. They think most of this period of the migration period where the barbarians invade the West, it's mostly around 100 years, from about maybe 376 to 378. Because actually in the 4th century, the Romans let the Goths come into the empire and settle there, and it created internal conflicts within the empire. Here's kind of a map that they sometimes use to describe all the different barbarian invasions that attacked the Roman Empire. I'll kind of go through some of the ones that were kind of famous. The Visigoths, they're really the first group that really attacks the West. That's kind of famous. Under this king named King Alaric, they actually march westward from the eastern part of the empire through like Dalmatia, where Yugoslavia used to be, and into Italy. They actually sacked Rome in 410. And then from there, they pushed westward into where Spain is now. And if you know about what happened with the Visigoths would take over Spain and they would create their own state that was called the Visigothic Kingdom, which would, by the way, last till the early Middle Ages, to about 721 CE, when Muslim conquerors would take over Spain like the Moors. And then they have also the Ostrogoths, which were a cousin of the Visigoths. They later would attack Italy as well. They take it over in the late 5th century. They have their own kingdom also later. Ostrogothic kingdom, which reigns to about 553 CE as well. Then that video was talking about the Vandals, which came out of Germany too. The Vandals attacked the Western Empire as well. And in 455 CE, under this king named Gazaric, they attacked Rome again, sacked it. But the Vandals were more known for seizing control of North Africa. They had their own kingdom called the Vandal Kingdom as well, which you can see reigned from the 5th into the 6th century CE. And they actually took control of like North Africa, where Carthage used to be. They seized control of Sicily, Sardinia, and Corsica, and actually reigned it for a short time until Justinian, the Byzantine Empire, destroyed their kingdom in the 6th century. Also, the Franks, they're kind of famous later in the Middle Ages. They invade into France, called Gaul back then, and Gaul falls as well. Gaul's eventually going to, fall to the Franks, and they'll form their own kingdom too, called the Kingdom of the Franks, by about 481 CE, which they called it Francia or France. And so that's something that's really going to lead into the early Middle Ages. And then also, don't forget, you've got other peoples like the Angles and the Saxons, the Jews. So they're called Anglo-Saxon peoples. They come out of Northern Europe, like Germany and Denmark, using ships, and they attack Rome and Britain. They seize that too, as well. They'll form their own states later, Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, like you see there, East Anglica, Mercia, Northumbria, Wessex, etc. All those kings are kind of famous. Like Wessex is, Alfred the Great rules over in England later. So basically, the West is being taken over by these different barbarians between the 4th and 5th centuries. So yeah, it's kind of a mess right there, but that's what happens. The Eastern Empire gets attacked too, but their emperors are more stronger. Their armies are better in the West. A lot of the Western emperors are having to rely on mercenaries. That's one of the things that happened. And a lot of them were Germans, and the Germans, eventually will just take over the empire in the West because of that. Now, they also have the Huns, which really, that particular group was the most feared by people in Europe, not just in the Western part, but in the Eastern Roman Empire as well. And who are the Huns? The Huns were these nomadic peoples that came out of Eurasia, and they attacked the Roman Empire. They attacked the Eastern Roman Empire and also the Western Roman Empire. And they were notorious as great warriors. They fought on horseback, just like the Mongols did later. They fought with composite bow. And there's different theories on the origins of the Huns. They think the Huns were likely these Asiatic peoples that they think came out of like Central Asia, like very close to where Mongolia is today. If you remember correctly, we had talked about the Xiongnu. They had attacked China years ago. I think there's a theory that Huns may have been descended from them and maybe the later Mongols as well. Here's kind of a map showing you the Hunnic Empire. It was called, some people later call it the Empire of Attila, who, of course, is one of their most famous rulers that they have. But they think it was a type of empire that stretched from like Russia in like the Ukraine all the way into Eastern Central Europe. So they controlled territory that went all the way probably westward, close to where Hungary is today. In fact, the name Hungary is evolved from the name Hun, if you know about that. It wasn't just Huns like that were in it. They had other people, like I think a lot of Germans joined it as well. So it was kind of a coalition of like Huns and Germanic tribes that formed this empire. And they had a capital, which they think was close to Budapest, but I'm not sure if they know the name of it. But it was in a region that the Romans called Pannonia, is a common name of the area that's close to where Hungary and I guess Austria is today. Of course, Attila the Hun, as you know, was their greatest king. He would reign, you can see, almost 20 years as a ruler. And a lot of people in Europe, especially Christians, called him the scourge of God because they thought they were sent by God to punish them. In fact, the Huns themselves were called the scourge of the earth. And I think a lot of the Huns were pagan. They weren't traditionally Christian, I know. And they were known for butchering cities. When they would take a city, they would just kill everybody there, men, women, and children, until it didn't care. He just killed everybody. And so he kind of got a bad name because of that. But he was, like I said, a feared warrior and king. That was, of course, the most famous, of course, of their rulers. Here's kind of, course, the image showing you. But yeah, there, of course, Attila the Hun, of course, or just Attila, of course, king of the Huns. But yeah, he would form this alliance that would be created between various Huns and Germanic tribes in Central Europe. And he would use that actually to form a huge army. I think there's a theory that his armies were like 200,000 troops at one point, mostly fighting on horseback, like cavalry. And he would use this to attack the Roman Empire because his plan was to basically seize the Roman Empire and maybe even become an emperor in right. Here's kind of a map here, kind of showing a picture here, excuse me, of the Huns. Huns first go after the Eastern Roman Empire. The ruler in the East was this emperor named Theodosius II. He was a grandson of Theodosius the Great, the Theodosian dynasty. He had to fight off the attack of the Huns. And because of that, if you know about what happened in the East, they built this huge fortification that's called the Theodosian walls that were built to protect the Byzantine Empire's capital of Constantinople. And these fortifications were mostly put in because of these barbarians that were trying to attack the empire in the East. And it basically defended the Western approaches to the city of Constantinople. I think the average height of those walls you're looking at was something like 50 to 60 feet tall. And so that actually prevented the Huns from really taking the city of Constantinople. Now, of course, what Attila is most famous for, if you know about it, was in 451, he tried to famously invade Gaul, and I can seize control of that, what would be France. He was hoping to conquer the West and maybe even become the Western Emperor, of course. And of course, you can see as he went across what is now modern France today, he burned and massacred several cities: Worms, Mainz, Cologne, Trier, Metz, Reims, and a few other cities were basically burned to the stake. And a lot of the men, women, and children in those cities, a lot of them that were captured, and they were basically butchered by the Huns. However, what happened was the Romans were able to rally a force to defeat Attila. There was this Roman general that was named Flavius Aetius, really considered one of the greatest Roman generals in the 5th century. He had a nickname or title they gave him later, which was the last of the Romans. Considered one of the last great Roman generals, especially that fought in the West. And he put together a coalition army of Roman and barbarian, which included like Visigoths, Franks, Saxons, Alans, and they were able to beat Attila's huge army at the Battle of Catalaunian Fields, which happened on June 20th, 451. And they do consider that battle, by the way, to be the last major battle that the Romans win really in the West, like when the Western Empire exists, all that. Because after that, things deteriorate even further. Their empire is just taken over by mostly Germans. And so that's going to help proceed to it later. But at that point, Attila was defeated. And Attila kept trying to fight, though. If you know about this, he then tried to attack Italy, which he did in 452. He tried to go after Italy and seize that and maybe take the capital of Ravenna. And so he marched into northern Italy at that point. And however, there was a case where the Pope came out. If you know about this, there was a Pope named Pope Leo I, also called Leo the Great. He actually went and met with Attila in 452, and he somehow was able to talk Attila into basically leaving, like not attacking Italy anymore. And so he marched out, and they're not sure what happened. I think there's a theory that maybe they just bribed him and paid tribute to him, like gave him a lot of money, and that's what caused him to, go back to basically Hungary at that point. And so that's got kind of what they think caused that to occur. But kind of bizarre thing, though. They think Attila was probably planning to attack them again, maybe in 453 or 454. But apparently it was a case where Attila, on his wedding night, he was marrying this young woman, bride, and he had a horrible nosebleed, and he drowned in his own blood. And so Attila died after that. And so his empire, the Hunnic Empire, collapsed afterwards. Now, what occurred after that, they had one more major ruler that kind of reigns in the West that's real famous, you may have heard about. His name is Romulus Augustus. What happens by 476, the Germans, I told you were trying to take over the West, they start taking control. And what they do is they actually depose the last major Western Roman emperor. It was done by this German general named Odoacer. And he kind of made him step down at that point. Here, kind of an image of him right here, Romulus Augustulus, as he's called. And he only reigned for about 10 months. He may have been a teenager, I think, real young, like 12 maybe when he came to power. Not sure about how old he was exactly. But he was forced to basically step down at that point. Maybe he was 14 at the oldest, they think, maybe when he abdicated his throne. And he went into retirement. They're not sure what happened to him. I think some people think he may have lived into the 6th century, 511. Some people think he may have even lived up to the 540s, they think, as well, Romulus Augustulus. But the name is ironic. His first name, Romulus, is named for the first Roman king. And then you got Augustulus, right, is a variation of the first Roman emperor, Augustus. I think Augustulus actually means little August, is what it means. And so basically when he steps down at that point, there's no more Western emperors after that, after 476. So one thing that happened, if you know about it, there was this famous historian named Edward Gibbon in the 18th century, wrote this series of books called The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, which is probably the greatest series of books ever written about the Roman Empire. And he's the one that popularized the idea that 476 was the date when the Roman Empire collapsed. And so from then on, there's only one empire afterwards, which is more in the east that they have. So really what happened was, you kind of show you a map right here, but Eastern Roman Emperor that's over there, I think his name was Emperor Zeno, he's actually the sole emperor of the whole thing, but in the West, they don't recognize an emperor anymore. They start carving up their own kingdoms at that point, like Germanic or barbarian kingdoms kind of form afterwards. And you get the Byzantine or Eastern Roman Empire that emerges after that. It's actually going to continue up through the Middle Ages. In fact, the Byzantine Empire collapses in 1453 CE. So they had a lot of influence, the Romans, on history, like 2,000 years, influencing all kinds of people over time. But you can see it shrank over time. I think under Justinian the Great in this mid-6th century, he actually would take back part of the West, like North Africa, Spain, and Italy. But over time in the Middle Ages, it shrank until it became a small state. And then the Ottoman Empire, if you know about it, conquered it in 453. They took the city of Constantinople. So after that, you then get the Middle Ages that come in afterwards with the fall of the Roman Empire. And that's basically, where we're at after that. But let me get into, of course, I'll talk about the main topics today. Of course, that'll be on the final exam, of course, on the Roman Empire. I'll go through all the questions. Of course, I did post that study guide of the actual, questions that are kind of be on the actual, exam for the Roman Empire. So I'll go ahead and share those with you again. I think they appeared at the end of the PowerPoint lectures I gave you, but I did post them also in Canvas. They should be also posted with the actual exam later next week as well. So yeah, let me go ahead and first talk about the beginning. So going back to after 44 BC, so what alliance did Octavian form in 43 BC and who was in it? That was the second triumvirate that formed. Octavian formed this alliance with two men, Mark Antony and Marcus Lepidus. And of course, they used that alliance to defeat the liberators, the ones that had killed Julius Caesar, led to the so-called Liberators' Civil War, where they defeated them and Brutus and Cassius killed themselves. Remember that. How did Octavian and Mark Antony divide up the Republic as a dictatorship? They eventually pushed Marcus Lepidus out, and Octavian kind of ruled over the West, and then Antony ruled over the East with Cleopatra and her children. And that created conflict between the two, and that led to a civil war. What civil war ended the Roman Republic? The War of Actium, which happened around 30 BC. And Octavian's forces invaded the eastern part of the Republic and defeated Antony and Cleopatra. And then, remember, those two, Antony and Cleopatra, committed suicide. What was the outcome of Octavian defeating Mark Antony and Cleopatra? Well, Octavian then consolidated all the power in the Republic and then formed an empire out of it afterwards. What is Octavian usually called after he becomes the first Roman emperor? Octavian is known as Augustus or Caesar Augustus. And after that, of course, he forms the Roman Empire and, of course, is seen as also the founder of it. What historical period follows the Roman Republic in Roman history? Obviously, the Roman Empire, of course, we're talking about. What does Octavian do after consolidating sole power of Rome? It's kind of a repeat question in there. But yeah, obviously becomes the Roman emperor. And he's called Augustus, like we've talked about, Caesar Augustus, but the name he preferred, the title he preferred, was Princeps or Princeps Civitas, which meant first citizen. And that led to the so-called Principate of the Roman Empire, where the emperors kind of went by that title up to the time of Diocletian, I guess, in 284. And Diocletian will later use another title, which is Dominus. What was the age of Augustus? What era of Roman peace begins under his reign? The age of Augustus was the nickname of Augustus' reign, which was 40-something years, 44 years. And it was considered a golden age. It's also called the Augustan age. And it's not just a period where the Roman Empire starts to flourish, being, fully developed, but it's also like a period of like literature, art. You have a lot of famous writers at the time, like Livy, I think I talked about before, and so on. Virgil, they're kind of all writing, about that same time period. Augustus also started what they call the Pax Romana, which was that 200 period in Roman history, which was the peak of that empire, which goes roughly, I guess, 27 BC up to about 180 CE or AD. Who are some historians that wrote about the early emperors of Rome? I think I mentioned several of them. Tacitus, considered one of the greatest Roman historians, wrote the Annals and the Histories of Rome. I think those are the two most famous ones. Suetonius had a series of books called The 12 Caesars. And then Cassius Dio, sometimes Dio Cassius, wrote a series of books. I think it was 80 volumes. So it's called The History of Rome. as well. What was the Praetorian Guard? It was the imperial bodyguard of the Roman emperors, and it was founded by Augustus during his reign. And so it's something that would be kind of important later politically, behind the power of the emperors. What dynasty was founded by Augustus? Who were the emperors that were in it? Augustus created a dynasty called later the Julio-Claudian dynasty because it has two families in it, the Julian-Claudian families. Gus is the founder, and then you have four other emperors, Tiberius, Caligula, Claudius, and Nero. So those are the five that are basically in it. What are these emperors famous for? Well, Emperor Tiberius was a Roman general, was the second Roman emperor. He was adopted by Augustus and actually married Augustus' daughter, and he was also his son-in-law. And Tiberius was an unpopular ruler. Remember, I told you he was tyrannical, and it's under him that they think Jesus Christ was, crucified. And so after he died, he was replaced by Caligula, who was known as Little Boots, who was his nephew. And Caligula was that emperor I told you that maybe went crazy or insane, some people think. And Caligula was later assassinated by the Praetorian Guard. So he had a very short reign, only about 4 years. And then his uncle reigned, who was Claudius, who was from Gaul. And Claudius was actually considered a pretty good emperor. Him and Augustus were the two best of that dynasty. Claudius was one of the first emperors to give people citizenship outside of Italy. He was also the emperor that started the invasion of Britain because the Romans, over like a 40, 50-year period, try to conquer it afterwards. Claudius was also, they think, possibly poisoned or murdered by his fourth wife, Agrippina. Then you got Nero, that picture, of course, on the left. Nero is the last of the Julio-Claudian dynasties. He was another tyrannical kind of ruler that was later unpopular. He's famous for a bunch of things. He's known for the Boudica revolt, where in Britain that Queen Boudica, remember some of those Celtic Britain tribes revolted. Also, Great Fire of Rome in 64 CE. He was later blamed for it. And then don't forget also, Nero was one of the first to be the one that will persecute the Christians, first of several emperors that do that. And his reign eventually collapsed in 68, causing a civil war. And of course, he committed suicide. Then we talked about the early background of Christianity. We talked about Jesus of Nazareth, or Jesus Christ. And of course, remember, he was considered the central figure, maybe founder of Christianity later, just based off of his life and teachings. So he's kind of the important figure associated with that. And I told you how Christianity becomes the largest religion in the world, eventually founded in the eastern part of the Roman Empire, where Israel is now. The governor of Judea that put him to death was Pontius Pilate, who, by the way, is mentioned not just in the New Testament, he's mentioned in multiple sources. In fact, Flavius Josephus writes a lot about him, if you know about that. What was the apostolic age? Apostolic age was the period after Jesus' crucifixion. Goes up to about 100. It's the period where the apostles began to spread Christianity throughout the Roman Empire. Who were some famous apostles of Jesus? The closest one to Jesus was St. Peter, or they call him Peter, or Simon Peter, of course, who later is seen by the Catholic Church as being the first pope or bishop of Rome. St. John, the apostle, sometimes called the evangelist, was another important figure as well. He was believed to be one of the apostles that they think wrote the Gospel of John and maybe even the book of Revelation. He had a brother named James the Greater, St. James, who they think was important in spreading Christianity to the western part of the Roman Empire, as far away as Spain. Also talked about James the Less. James the Less, or Lesser, was another saint, St. James. They think he may have been a brother of Jesus, and sometimes later some people call him James the Just. as well. They also had St. Matthew was another one that was kind of famous too as an apostle. Why was Paul or Saul, of course, St. Paul, Paul of Tarsus, important to early Christianity? They think Paul was the one apostle that was the most important one, most influential in the first century. Originally from Turkey, Paul converted, originally called Saul, converted to Christianity and began communicating with different churches, throughout the Roman world and traveled throughout the Roman world and, preached to different people. And of course, Paul was known for his epistles, the epistles of Paul, which make up a bunch of the books in the New Testament later. It's often called Paul the Apostle or also the Apostle to the Gentiles as well. What are the four gospel accounts in the New Testament? I already talked about that before, but Matthew, Luke, Mark, and John, of course, are the four gospels that'll be eventually canonized, I think, by the 4th century by the early Christian church. What two main Christian sects kind of emerged in the 1st century BC? Well, Christianity kind of divided. You got those that were like Jewish Christians that were the original Christians that were, following Jesus. I think a lot of those were called Nazarenes sometimes. They did have another group called the Ebionites that kind of broke off from them as well. And you had those Christians that were Gentile Christians, or I guess Roman Christians that were pagans that converted to Christianity. They were never Jewish, that kind of thing. And so you get these two that kind of basically split. The ones that were the Jewish Christians, they faded away because of the fact that the second temple was destroyed. It's part of why they split it, was because of that. And then Judaism kind of broke away from Christianity because of theological differences between the two. The Jews don't think Jesus is the Messiah, that kind of thing. Also, I told you about the Jewish tax was another reason why people wanted to be a Christian instead of a Jew, because if you were Jewish in the Roman Empire, you had to pay this tax that they had. So there's a lot of different things that broke them apart, but Judaism goes on to be more like rabbinic Judaism with synagogues and things like that. And then the Christians become more Romanized around churches and priests. Then, of course, I talked about these two rival Christian churches that eventually emerge that were kind of part of the Roman Empire. In the West, you have the Roman Catholic Church based in Rome with the Pope later. And you got the Eastern Orthodox Church based in Constantinople that broke away, that was part of the Eastern Roman Empire or Byzantine Empire. I think their religious leaders called a patriarch, that later. But those two break apart. And then by the end of the Middle Age, you have also Protestantism too that kind of comes in. Who took over and founded the Flavian dynasty after the Julio-Claudian dynasty collapsed with the death of Nero? Well, I told you I had the Civil War where they had the year of the 4 emperors. In that picture on the left, you get Flavius Vespasian that seizes power, who was a Roman general. And so Vespasian was the one that founds the Flavian dynasty. What famous war broke out around 66 AD under Emperor Nero in the region of Judea? Well, Vespasian became famous for fighting in that war, along with his son Titus. So both those two men, those two generals, actually were the ones that put down the revolt, which was a very bloody conflict, by the way. The first Jewish-Roman war, or some people call it the Great Jewish War or Revolt or something like that, or just the Jewish War. But it made both those men famous because Titus goes on to, sack Jerusalem and the Second Temple. What famous building did Vespasian build? Vespasian was known for constructing the Roman Colosseum, that huge amphitheater or stadium, which was used for mass entertainment. And they think Titus is the one that finished it and opened it up. What was Emperor Titus known for? Titus was a Roman general who was a son of Vespasian. And if you know about Titus, he was the first son to succeed his father as emperor, which he did in the year 79. And Titus had previously been known for, being involved in that Jewish war. He had sacked Jerusalem, destroyed the Second Temple, And then he's also known for the eruption of Mount Vesuvius, which destroyed cities like Pompeii in the southern part of Italy, where Naples is. And so Titus had a very short reign. It was only like a little bit over 2 years. Then he had a brother who came in, they considered tyrannical, who was Emperor Domitian. And Domitian reigned for 15 years, the longest reign of the three Flavian emperors. And Domitian was known for being assassinated in 96 CE or AD. Then you have the period of the five good emperors comes in, 96 to 180. Remember I talked about how the five good emperors, they had in a row, according to Machiavelli. And it's a period where you have this dynasty that reigns called the Nerva Antonine dynasty. And the five emperors that were in it were Marcus Nerva, Marcus Trajan, Hadrian, Antoninus Pius, and then you had Marcus Aurelius. And I'll kind of go through those. Nerva was the first one. Nerva was like this advisor of Domitian that was put in power as emperor by this Roman Senate. And then he was succeeded by Trajan. Remember, I told you these emperors were sometimes called later adoptive emperors because each one adopted a successor and all that. Trajan was this emperor that came from Spain who was really a general. He was kind of like this militaristic leader that was known for his conquests in the east, like conquering Dacia in Romania, parts of Turkey like Armenia and Georgia. Then he also took back Iraq against the Parthian Empire as examples. And Trajan was known for his building projects. Remember, he was the one that was called Optimus Princeps, the best ruler. And he was known for his building projects like Trajan's Forum, that was known for its markets and its baths, and the famous, also the Trajan's Column. Then he was succeeded by Hadrian. They think, was a cousin of his, who was also from Spain. Hadrian was known as the Greekling. Remember that? He was kind of this emperor that was fond of art, especially Greek culture and things like that, and was this amateur architect that's well known. Hadrian was the one that abandoned Trajan's expansionism and went more to building like fortifications and more stable borders. And Hadrian's known for building Hadrian's Wall, which was this fortification that the Romans constructed to defend the northern border of Rome and Britain from barbarians. It was about an 80-mile long wall. And he was also known for other building projects like rebuilding what they call the Pantheon Temple, which was a famous Roman temple that had been destroyed by a fire previously. I think going back to the time of, I want to say, Emperor Titus, and so he reconstructed it. I think also Hadrian, I mentioned before, was the one that also put down the Bar Kokhba revolt, which was that other famous Jewish revolt that happened in Israel. Then Antoninus Pius came in. He was a famous emperor that was really the peak ruler of the Pax Romana. He kind of starts a dynasty called the Antonines. And if you remember correctly, it was a very peaceful period of the Roman Empire, very few wars going on. I think the only thing that he did that was famous was he conquered part of Britain up to where Scotland is. And he built a fortification up there. It was called the Antonine Wall, but they abandoned it later. And then Antoninus Pius adopted two men as his successors, Marcus Aurelius and also Lucius Verus, who became kind of like brothers. And they co-ruled together afterwards. There, of course, Marcus Aurelius on the left in that picture. Marcus Aurelius is probably considered one of the greatest of the five good emperors. The last one they have, Marcus Aurelius was known for a lot of his military campaigns. Like, if you know about it, Lucius Verus was famous for retaking part of Mesopotamia and Syria that had basically fallen to the Parthian Empire. They fought a series of Parthian wars over there. And then the big wars that Marcus Aurelius fought in, of course, was the Marcomannic Wars, where they fought for control of the Danube River Valley to prevent Germanic peoples from invading into the empire. And then he was also known for being this philosopher type emperor I told you about, where he studied Stoicism, and he wrote a series of books that were compiled later into a work that was called the Meditations, or the Meditations of Marcus Aurelius, which were really personal writings that were never meant for publication, but they became famous later in modern times. Then you have Emperor Commodus comes in. What was he famous for? Commodus was the son of Marcus Aurelius. He was in part of the Antonine dynasty. And he ruled afterwards as sole ruler after his father died. And they think Commodus is the emperor they think that ended the Pax Romana. I think some claim that 180, the year 180 AD or CE is considered when the Pax Romana comes to end. And remember, Commodus was this tyrannical ruler that some people thought was insane. And he was the one that was famous for fighting as a gladiator, like in the Colosseum. And his assassination in the year 192 caused this major civil war that was called the Year of the Five Emperors. That happened in 193. What was the Severan dynasty? What emperors were part of this imperial Roman dynasty? Well, at the end of that civil war, Year of the Five Emperors, this African general seized power, Septimius Severus, who was from Libya. He came in, founded his own dynasty called the Severan dynasty, lasts from 193 to 235. And he and his relatives kind of controlled it throughout that period. It's a very bloodthirsty dynasty, by the way, because most of the emperors were killed, except for him. He had a famous wife you may have heard of. I told you about Empress consort Julia Domna. And Julia Domna had two sons, of course, through them, which was Caracalla and Gaeta, who I think were the only twin sons, or whatever, that reigned as emperors, actually co-ruling at one point. Now, if I remember correctly, Caracalla was the one that killed his brother Gaeta because he wanted to rule by himself. And Caracalla is famous for his edict of Caracalla that gave people citizenship throughout the Roman Empire if they were free. And Caracalla was also known for the baths of Caracalla too. They have this guy named Macrinus, who was a Roman prefect. I think he was in the Praetorian Guard. He killed off Caracalla and seized power. And then later you had two more rulers that reigned, Elagabalus and Severus Alexander, who were cousins of the Severans. They also reigned later, but they were both killed as well. Then says, what historical period of the 3rd century almost caused the collapse of the Roman Empire? Well, you have this 50-year period I told you about called the crisis of the 3rd century. It goes from 235 to 284. After the last Severan, Severus Alexander, was assassinated, it created this chaotic event where there was like this imperial anarchy throughout the empire and behind the throne, and the empire almost collapsed. They also had a lot of invasions, economic problems, and the empire almost broke up as well. And what were the emperors nicknamed during this 50-year period that they were in power? A lot of the emperors were called barracks emperors or soldier emperors because they came out of the Roman army, a lot of them. And there was even a case I told you where in the year 238 CE or AD, you had 6 emperors that reigned. They call it the so-called year of the 6 emperors. And so a lot of chaos behind the throne that was kind of going on. What 2 empires broke off from the Roman Empire during the crisis period of the 3rd century? They had one empire in the west that formed called the Gallic Empire that controlled like Gaul and Britain. And they had another one called the Palmyrene Empire that also broke away, that controlled part of Turkey, Israel, and Syria down into Egypt. And this general named Aurelian came in, and you see on the left there, Emperor Aurelian, he basically reconquered those 2 states and forced them to reform with the Roman Empire. So he reunited the whole thing. And so he was known as the so-called restorer of the world. I think there's a repeat question in that slide right there. But yeah, the emperors were called barracks emperors a lot during that time period. Also, Aurelian, don't forget, He was the one that built the so-called Aurelian walls, which were these fortifications that superseded the Severan, the Servian walls, excuse me, that had been previously built a long time ago during the Roman kingdom. And so those became some of the main fortifications they used to defend the city. What new title did Emperor Diocletian? Now, Diocletian comes in, he begins making reforms to the Roman Empire that help save it, kind of in that crisis period at that point. And he adopts a more authoritarian, autocratic title. It's more despotic, which, of course, is called Dominus. And it means either Lord or Master, and they kind of get rid of that pretense that the emperor is a first citizen, that kind of thing. And so from then on, around 284 up to, I guess, the fall of the Roman Empire and after, uh, that's the so-called Dominate period. So the later part of the Roman Empire. What political reform divided the Roman Empire into four parts with the Western and Eastern Roman empires? The Tetrarchy, of course, is what he, of course, creates. And what it does, it basically has this case where the empire is ruled by four rulers, which are called tetrarchs. And it has two main emperors, which were both called Augustus. They have a Western Augustus and an Eastern Augustus. So those are the two main emperors. And then you got these two successor emperors that are under them, that are called Caesars. So you got a Western Caesar and you have an Eastern Caesar. So they basically break the empire up into four parts, basically, where each one kind of rules over each one. So the Tetrarchs are almost like having four kings or four emperors in a sense for a short time there, but it lasts up until like about, I think I told you before, about 324. What was the Edict of Maximum Prices developed by Emperor Diocletian about 301? That was an attempt to set like the price of goods throughout the Roman Empire, and even it fixed people's like wages and things like that. And it was an attempt to kind of reel in inflation problems throughout the Roman Empire, but it actually ultimately failed. People ignored it, and a lot of the problems behind inflation weren't really solved until Constantine the Great came in, and a lot of it just had to do with like a lot of the money, which I think a lot of the money I told you before was kind of starting to be debased. They're taking the minerals out of the money and things like that, and they had to add that back in to make them worth more, the money. What was the Diocletianic persecution or Great Persecution? That was the last persecution of Christians in the Roman Empire, which was started by Diocletian in the Tetrarchs. And it was an attempt to save the traditional Roman religions, paganism throughout the Roman Empire. And I told you how Christianity was becoming very popular. In fact, Christianity, I think, had increased by something like 600% since the mid 3rd century. And so ultimately it failed. And of course, later on, the empire by the end of the 5th century is going to become a Christian state mostly. What Roman leader eventually ended the Tetrarchy after civil wars broke out between the various four rulers? That would be on the left there, Constantine the First, also called the Great. And he would eventually conquer the West and become the main Western Augustus when he defeated the ruler, for I guess the one that wanted to control the West too, which was Maxentius, who he beat at the Battle of Milvian Bridge. Supposedly at that bridge in 312 or around that time, they think that Constantine began to convert to Christianity. Eventually, he'll be, also baptized as well. And so that led to eventually the end of the persecution of Christians. So him and this other emperor in the East, Eastern Augustus, which will be Galerius, both of them passed edicts that ended the persecutions. Galerius had the Edict of Serdica, also called Toleration, in 311. And then the Edict of Milan was passed in 313 by Constantine the Great. Both those made Christianity a legal religion throughout the empire, and that ended the persecutions afterwards. But Christianity will not be the state religion, like the only state religion they have, until Theodosius the Great comes in later. What was the first council of Nicaea that met in 325 AD or CE? That was one of the first major church councils which met in the eastern part of the Roman Empire in Turkey. And they met there to decide like the theological background of the Christian church, like what books they would use and things like that, and what God is, etc. What were some Christian theological reforms that were famous for they developing? Well, one thing was they decided that Arian Christianity or Arianism was heretical, like the teachings of Arius from Egypt. And that led to the development of the Trinity or Trinitarianism afterwards. And then they also forced Christians to also say, like the Nicene Creed, by the way, which was that Christian prayer of faith that they put like in the Mass. And that was, of course, an attempt to stamp out, of course, Arian heresy, basically. They decided like what the Easter Sunday dates and things like that were put in afterwards, they think. And then afterwards, too, they think that the Bible starts to be compiled, like the New Testament and later the Old Testament as well, especially by like 400. What famous city did Constantine found? Where was it established within the Roman Empire? Constantine founded Constantinople, which became this new capital of the Roman Empire, found in the east, in western Turkey, south of the Black Sea, in the Sea of Marmara. And if you know about this capital, it'll later merge to be the capital of the Eastern Roman Empire or Byzantine Empire. And it's now called Istanbul. How long does this empire continue in the Middle Ages? It, of course, continued up to 1453. They call it Byzantine Empire because they believe the city was built on this Greek city that was called Byzantium or Byzantium. Remember that correctly? So that's the primary name. It's called later, but I think people call it still Roman Empire or Romania, I think is the common name they call it. But you get these two separate empires that eventually kind of are created, Western Roman Empire and the Eastern Roman Empire, or Byzantine. What was Emperor Theodosius the Great famous for as a ruler of the Roman Empire? He's famous for two things. One, he's the one that passes this edict that's called the Edict of Thessalonica in the year 380. It was issued, I think, somewhere in Greece. And what it did was it made Nicene Christianity the state religion. And so that led to the end of like paganism as being a religion, traditional religions in the Roman Empire, which they began to persecute pagans and ban it. They also banned the Olympics too in Greece as well, a little later, I think around 393. And then I told you that 395, what happened was he split the empire among his two sons, Arcadius in the east, Eastern Empire, and then Honorius got the western part of the empire overall. And he was the last emperor to be the sole ruler of both halves, like basically sole ruler of the Roman Empire, and then he broke it up permanently after that. What were causes of the decline of the Roman Empire, especially in the West? Well, the West had a lot of internal problems that they had, like we talked about before, under the 3rd century. But they think the thing that eventually killed it off was the fact that it was invaded by all these different barbarians. So you get the barbarian invasions, or they call it the migration period that comes in, where you get these different Germanic and other Eurasian peoples that enter into the Roman Empire. What were some German peoples that invaded the Western Empire? There was a bunch of them. The Goths, of course, the most famous, the Visigoths and the Ostrogoths, Vandals, the Franks, the different Anglo-Saxon tribes, and then Alemanni, I think, was another that was very famous as well. Then you had various people like those different kind of the Slavic peoples, of course, that entered into the empires as well. The Huns were very famous as well. Of course, the most feared were the Huns, if you know about that. Why were many of them called federati? A lot of the Germans were called federati because they were used as mercenaries. That's like the Roman term for like Roman mercenaries or foreign mercenaries that were hired within the Roman Empire. And over time, they take over the West, like especially the Germans do, and they'll eventually carve the empire up in the West into different uh, barbarian type kingdoms that'll eventually come about and lead to the Middle Ages. What areas they eventually settle and occupy? I'll kind of briefly talk about this again, but the Visigoths were one of the most famous uh, of these first barbarians that attacked the Roman Empire, which started in the Eastern Empire. And under this king named King Alaric, they marched westward and attacked Italy, and they actually sacked Rome in the year 410. And they kept marching westward. They eventually took over the area where Spain is now, and they formed a kingdom out of it that was called the Visigothic Kingdom. Then another famous Germanic people, the Vandals, where you know where the word vandalism comes from. They also attacked the Roman Empire too, led by this king named King Gazaric. Gazaric invaded into the Western Empire, but he crossed the Mediterranean and took over North Africa, where he would form eventually a kingdom out of that area that's called the Vandal Kingdom. But the Vandals were also known for sacking Rome too in the year 455 as well. Franks were another one. The Franks were this Germanic people. I think it's kind of Western Germany. They attack also Gaul and seize it, and they'll form a kingdom out of it later, which is the Francia, or the Kingdom of the Franks, which is founded by this king named King Clovis. We'll get to like in the Middle Ages later. But that's the Franks. That's where you get the word France from, of course, later. And then the Anglo-Saxons were these Germanic peoples in the northern part of Europe. They crossed the North Sea, attacked Rome and Britain, eventually seized control of it, and they eventually break it up into different Anglo-Saxon kingdoms as well. This kind of leads into medieval England a little later, of course, after that. Who were the Huns? Of course, that last barbarian group I got into. The Huns were these Eurasian peoples, nomadic peoples that came out of the east, and they were famous, kind of like the Mongols, were fighting on horseback with composite bow, swords, etc. And the Huns attacked the Eastern and the Western Roman empires. You know about this, I told you there were these two emperors that were kind of cousins that were fighting at the same time to stop the Huns and other barbarians from taking over the empire. In the East, Eastern Roman Empire, you had Theodosius II. He was the grandson of Theodosius the Great. He was one who built the Theodosian walls, and so he had to try to fight off the Huns and other barbarians. They were attacking the East, and the Theodosian walls really prevented some of these barbarian groups from really taking Constantinople, if you know about that. And then he had a cousin in the West, Valentinian III. I told you he was like one of the last great rulers in the West. He reigned like something like 30 years. He also fought off the Huns, and part of why he was successful was he had some great generals under him, like Flavius Aetius, the last of the Romans. Then, of course, you had Attila the Hun, the scourge of God. You know, he attacks, of course, the Roman Empire. Attila was the greatest king, of the Huns. And Hunnic Empire under him, they first attacked the Eastern Roman Empire, which mostly failed to conquer it, of course. And then he's more famous for attacking the Western Roman Empire, which he did in the 450s. Early 450s, like 451 to 452 mostly. And what areas did Attila Hun invade and almost conquer in the West? First tried to conquer Gaul, where France is. And in Gaul, which he sacked a lot, if you know about that, I talked about before, In the Battle of Catalonian Plains, he was actually defeated by a Roman barbarian army, which was kind of compiled of like Romans and Germanic federati. And I told you how Flavius Aetius led this coalition of forces that would beat him in June of 451. It's also called Catalonian Fields, or I think some call it also the Battle of Chalon or Chalons as well. And so he then tried to attack Italy, remember, in 452, but the Catholic Church intervened, and they think Pope Leo the Great, Leo the First, they think somehow turned Attila back. I'm thinking they must have bribed him. That's probably what they did. But he died in 453, and the Hunnic Empire then collapsed. Who was later seen as one of the last major Western Roman emperors to step down. Of course, I told you Romulus Augustulus. He was this little kid you see on the left. I don't know, he may have been like 12 or 13 or something like that, the oldest. And he was the last major emperor they have in the West. He'd only been reigning for less than a year. And he was forced to abdicate by this Germanic general named Odoacer, who made himself king in Italy after that. And so following that, there were no more emperors in the West. What year is seen as being the date when the Western Roman Empire collapsed or existed no more a Western ruler? 476 AD or CE, of course, is seen as the year. Of course, I told you how Edward Gibbon, they think in modern times, in the 19th century, wrote that famous series of books called The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. He popularized that idea of that. But in reality, the emperor, I guess in the East, I think it's Emperor Zeno at the time, was actually the emperor in the West. There's only one ruler now. But the barbarians that were taking over the West, they didn't recognize an emperor in the West and all that. They kind of create their own states out of it. And that leads into the Middle Ages, of course, following that.